All right, so I guess we're ready to get started here with the last of the last lecture series. And I think probably the place to start is to say thanks to Eddie Rodriguez for having the idea and then also having the perseverance to actually get 4 academics to commit to doing this every Thursday, 4 weeks in a row. And I tried my hardest to ruin it for him at the end, but here I am giving the last of the last lectures. I have given this some thought. I'm not going to say, a myriad of thoughts, but I've given it some thought about what exactly I would talk about as a last lecture. And one of the conclusions that I actually came to is that I wouldn't give a last lecture in the model that, I hope I pronounce his name correctly, Randy Prausch did. I watched a little bit of his YouTube phenomenon, and I actually came to the conclusion over the past couple weeks that I wouldn't actually do this. I would go do something else, to be honest. And so I thought, okay, so where does that leave me in terms of I'm not going to give a motivational speech, I'm not going to talk about how I lived out my childhood dreams, I'm not going to tell you that you should live out your childhood dreams, et cetera, et cetera. And what I came back to is sort of, well, what am I as a lecturer, right? It is a lecture. It's not the last moment. It is the last lecture. So as someone who occasionally gives lectures for a living, as an economist who speaks to groups of people, I thought I'd talk about things that I actually know about, things that I actually do. So I'm going to talk about some things that I work on as a professional and things that obviously I care about, or I wouldn't spend a whole lot of time working on them. But before I did that, I figured, well, one thing I would do is convey to the audience who I actually really am. And I hope that by the photos that I've chosen, you get a sense of what it is that really matters to me as a human being, not just as an economist. So my name is Jim Casey, class of '91 at Washington and Lee. I teach in economics and environmental studies. My wife, Lisa D'Amelio, is also an educator and has been teaching for the past 15 years across multiple countries and multiple age groups and so on, and right now teaches a pre-K class at Shenandoah Preschool, which is where I just came from. Shenandoah Preschool had their graduation ceremony tonight, and my daughter Olivia, on the top there, just became, I guess, officially a kindergartner as of about 10 minutes ago. So my 2 daughters, Katerina and Olivia, 8 and 5, pictured here, I want to say somewhere on the trail on the way to Lampshire Bay on the south side of St. John. We just went to the Virgin Islands for a little while on a research trip. So I got my PhD from North Carolina State in 2001 in forestry economics, and natural resource management. The areas that I'm most interested in as a scholar lie at the interface of environmental economics and economic development. So I wouldn't necessarily call myself a development economist or an environmental economist, but rather a social scientist who is interested in human behavior associated with both the pursuit of well-being and then how that relates to how humans interact with the natural world. I've been very fortunate to have done some field work in some really beautiful places and worked with wonderful people in Mexico and Belize and Guatemala, and recently in Barbados in the U.S. Virgin Islands. And the current things that I'm working on relate to the quality of coral reefs in the Caribbean, which is right at the interface of coastal development and environmental quality, biodiversity issues, and also exploring more locally some of the effects of biofuel development here in the Chesapeake Basin. So once again, thinking about economic development, in this case, the pursuit of alternative energies and their effects on a larger environmental resource, in this case, the Chesapeake Bay Basin. So before I get started again with my last lecture, I do everything with my family. So once again, this is me with my kids and my wife, again, conducting research in the Caribbean, okay? And so, again, to convey sort of who I am and where I'm coming from. And then beyond that, What I want to talk to you tonight about is what I've called, and I've stolen this title from the United Nations Development Report from this past year. I want to talk about fighting climate change, human solidarity in a divided world. And this issue of climate change and the idea of a divided world touch at the two areas that I do my research in. And that quote, climate change is one of the greatest challenges facing humanity, and it is the world's most vulnerable populations who are most immediately at risk. The actions of the wealthiest nations, those generating the vast majority of greenhouse gases, have tangible consequences for people in the rest of the world, especially the poorest nations. And as you can guess, this is some crazy left-wing climate hoaxer. No, it's the mayor of the city of New York, Michael Bloomberg, in response to having read the United Nations Human Development Report this past year. And there are many other folks just like him who see this as the issue facing all of you as you move forward. And it's not just about the environment, it's about people. So thinking about the groups of people who will be most affected by climate change. And so that's what I want to talk about. I want to talk about this issue of poverty in the environment. And so I start with a simple question, which is how divided, right? Fighting climate change in a divided world. Well, how divided is the world, right? Some people live like this. Some people live in nice skyscrapers like this. Almost half the world, 3 billion people approximately, live on less than $2.50 a day. And that's $2.50 adjusted for what's called purchasing power parity, so that it gives you an idea as someone who lives in a world of dollars, what could you buy with $2.50? So the equivalent of $2.50 every day, that's it, that's all you get. 3 billion people live like that. Okay? The numbers that development economists tend to focus on are these numbers down here. The absolute poverty line of less than $1 a day, of which there's still approximately 1 billion people who live on less than $1 a day. And then we're talking $1.25, $1.45, up to $2 a day. But how about $2.50? How about even $10 a day? So just pause for a moment and imagine you wake up in the morning and you've got $10 in your pocket and that's it. Right? $10, that's all you've got, okay? That's how 5.1 billion people exist on the planet. Right? Again, my last lecture, this may be something that you can choose to ignore. That's totally up to you. My responsibility as an educator, as someone who studies development economics, is to convey the reality of the world that we live in. And this is the reality. This is a number. Right? And so, again, I leave it up to you to think about what it means and to think about how you want to respond to that or not respond to that. But for me, it's about disseminating information on some level, creating information and disseminating information. Some folks live in houses that look like this. Disturbing fact, disturbing to me. I know I went a little normative on you there, right? 25,000 children die every single day. 25,000 kids on planet Earth will die every day. Mostly from things that are completely preventable. Where are these kids? I think this is another important thing to know as you move forward. They're in sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, East Asia, and the Pacific, primarily. Of course, other places in the world, but the big areas, 4.5 and 3 million kids every year. Right? This is a number from 2007. Okay? To give you an idea of when we think about sort of, to use a loose term, the haves and the have-nots, right? If we think across the socioeconomic spectrum, why is it that we think there's so much wealth in the world? People that most of us know live on a heck of a lot more than $10 a day. And an interesting fact is that the 13,000 richest families, this is in the United States, have the equivalent income as the 20 million poorest families in the United States. Once again, it's just a fact. That's all it is. 13,000 families have the same income as the bottom 20 million in the United States of America. Some folks live like this, and some folks live like this. In the past 30 years in the United States, the average salary for a factory worker in the United States of America has gone up from about $32,500 to $35,500, 10% increase over 30 years. CEOs at that time period, back in the 1970s, the top 100 CEOs in America made $1.3 million on average. Today they average $37.5 million. So the person at the top of the company as compared to the person who does the physical labor in that company, we went from a 39-to-1 ratio to a 1,000-to-1 ratio in a 30-year time period. Why? That's the question, right, that an economist would ask. Why is that the case? I'm not going to answer that question tonight. Tonight is just about getting some information out there. If it piques your interest, you can find out what economists think about why that's the case. Some folks live like this. That happens to be Bill Gates' home on Lake Washington. Some folks live like this. So the second part of my talk tonight is about how much change. So how divided? I think it's fairly obvious that we live on a planet with tremendous inequities in terms of opportunities and in terms of income and wealth and well-being. And then the second question related to that is how much change? What are we looking at in terms of climate change over the next 50 to 100 years? Lucky me, the folks at MIT do a lot of work in this area, and they put together really neat, eye-catching graphics. Right? So these are just two ways of thinking about warming possibilities by 2100 with no policy in place. So the world just keeps burning fossil fuels on its current path. And the one on the right that you're looking at is warming possibilities under sort of middle policy arrangements. Nothing extreme, but policies that obviously would cost something, right? But that are possible, that are doable. And one of the interesting things to note is that even on the right here, when we think about climate change with policy, you'll notice that we're going to see some changes. Over the next century, we're going to see a rise in the mean temperature on planet Earth. The middle probability, the middle of that distribution says somewhere between 2 and 2.5 degrees Celsius. The new work out of MIT, the work on the left, suggests that if we do absolutely nothing, if we continue down the path that we're on right now, we're looking at probably somewhere on the order of 4 to 6 degrees, maybe upwards of 7 degrees. And this is Celsius, mind you, not Fahrenheit. These are fairly extreme changes, and they're average changes. The latest models out of MIT suggest that the extreme regions of the Arctic and Antarctica could change up to 15 to 20 degrees Celsius in the next 50 to 75 years. That's an extreme change. And that is under a scenario of what we call business as usual. Nothing changes. We just continue to go about our business the way we have in terms of our consumption and production of fossil fuels. So some background on the climate change issue. If we think about, well, so why? Why is the planet warming? Primarily, we're talking about the emissions of carbon dioxide, of carbon. And if we look over from the period 1900 to 1999, this map simply lays out by percentages those areas of the world responsible for X% of carbon emissions to this point. So the United States and Europe, and then if we combine the former Soviet Union and Australia and Canada, we get most of the emissions. China, India, and the developing countries of South Asia are on their way, but historically, right, over a 100-year time period, have not contributed as much as the industrialized countries have. So this just gives you an idea of where have these emissions come from over time? This is looking at the aggregate contributions of greenhouse gas emissions across countries in the year 2005. And you should notice something about greenhouse gas emissions in total. And that is, by 2005, China had become the largest emitter of greenhouse gases. China, followed by the United States, followed by the European Union, makes up about 50% of the emissions. Okay? China, the US, the European Union. And this has very, very important implications for thinking about climate policy as we move forward. The interesting caveat here when we think about China and the United States, two countries responsible for almost 40% of the greenhouse gas emissions, is what does that look like on a per capita basis? Because if you'll recall, the population of China is about 1.2, 1.3 billion, and the population in the United States is about 300 million. And what this shows is that in 2005 and projected in 2030, each one of us living in the United States contributes about 20 tons, which is 4 times the amount that each individual in China contributes. This is another area that doesn't lend itself to easy policy making between the two largest emitters. Because on the one hand, we have China now emitting more in gross than the United States of America, but on a per capita energy consumption and emissions basis, the United States is still clearly well beyond where the Chinese are at this point. This is a picture that illustrates the relationship over time in greenhouse gas emissions from the present time to 2050. The blue region is what's called stabilization. So that's where we would have to make changes to stabilize the level of carbon emissions to keep it constant from today out to 2050. The green wedges are the 4 big areas where we could move from, you'll notice that BAU, that's the business as usual scenario, which suggests that greenhouse gas emissions will climb from now until 2050, and that the areas in which we can reduce our emissions relate primarily to renewable energy, the efficiency of buildings, the efficiency of transportation, and actually capturing carbon when it is emitted in the combustion process. Those are the 4 big areas where policy needs to be targeted if we're going to stabilize carbon emissions over time. The area that this adds on is the idea that, well, even beyond a business as usual scenario, isn't it possible that we'll explore oil shale, tar sands, and coal to liquids technologies, which will actually put us on an even faster path to rising emissions over time? The tar sands in Canada and Alberta, for example, per every unit of energy there's 2 to 3 times as much carbon emitted as per petroleum that we currently use. So if we decide to use the oil that comes out of the tar sands, there will be an increase in the amount of carbon dioxide that's emitted when we extract that resource and when we burn it for energy. The United Nations Development Program publishes its Human Development Report on a pretty much annual basis. And in 2000, 2008, as I've already said, their focus was on climate change and thinking about the individuals who will be most at risk under a world of rising sea levels, changing temperatures, changing rainfall patterns, etc. And policies are aimed currently at curbing climate change, and those designed to alleviate the suffering of the world's poorest are becoming increasingly linked. That is, that interface between economic development which ostensibly is to be aimed at alleviating suffering and improving well-being, and the environmental economic side, primarily looking at the negative externalities of pollution and thinking about how to internalize those externalities. That policies directed at those two areas are now not necessarily knocking heads, as is often presented in the popular press, but rather thinking about policies that can dually deal with the issues of climate change and economic prosperity. This is a direct quote from that report as well, that the world's poor and future generations cannot afford the complacency and prevarication that continues to characterize international negotiations on climate change. And there is I hope this will work. Sometimes these things go a little slow, but I wanted to share with you what I found to be the most compelling piece in the summary of this report. And there's a lot of figures and a lot of data and a lot of talk about costs and benefits and the distribution of those over time and over regions. And what I found most compelling in terms of thinking about the vulnerability of the world's poorest individuals and climate change was this piece right here by the Archbishop Emeritus of Cape Town, Desmond Tutu. And what Desmond Tutu basically has to say in this, I don't know if you'll be able to read it, it's kind of small, but I'll kind of summarize for you. I'll read the first paragraph. In a world that is so divided by inequalities in wealth and opportunity, it is easy to forget that we are part of one human community. As we see the early impacts of climate change registering across the world, each of us has to reflect on what it means to be a part of that family. Perhaps the starting point is to reflect on the inadequacy of language. The word adaptation has become part of the standard climate change vocabulary. But what does adaptation mean? The answer to that question is different things in different places. There are two primary policy avenues for thinking about climate change. One is called adaptation. As the climate changes, how do humans adapt to those changes? The second is what's called mitigation, which is if we know which gases are primarily responsible, can we mitigate those? Can we stop emitting so many and so much greenhouse gases? What Desmond Tutu is pointing out is that the word adaptation, feel the temperature in this room. If it's 45 degrees Celsius outside, none of us feel it. We're very well adapted to rising temperatures. If there's a flood in Lexington tonight, we have the resources to evacuate. We have the resources to move back into the community. We have the resources to feed and clothe and shelter each other until our community responds and recovers from that event. He asked the question here, how does an impoverished female farmer in Malawi adapt when more frequent droughts and less rainfall cut production? How does a slum dweller living beneath plastic sheets and corrugated tin in Manila or Port-au-Prince adapt to the threat posed by more intense cyclones? Adaptation for the poorest of the poor means death. That's it. There's no adaptation for the 20 or 30 some odd million individuals who live in southern Bangladesh for a 2 or 3 meter rise in sea level. There is no adaptation. And so what Desmond Tutu is calling upon the world to do, and this hit me specifically hard because when I teach climate change policy, I teach that there has to be a balance between adaptation and mitigation. That part of the scenarios that we're looking at is how will we adapt to a certain amount of climate change. And this struck a chord with me in that, what do I mean by adaptation? And what do others infer from that word adaptation? I can very easily adapt to changing conditions. Wealth and income and social structure allow us to adapt to things that may change very dramatically. But those individuals, and if you'll recall, 3 billion who live on less than $2.50 a day will not have the ability to adapt. Furthermore, they're not responsible for any of the changes up to this point. There clearly is a weight on those responsible for the changes to do more than simply adapt, but to mitigate. So that's the answer, right? But we can't afford it. When we think about the world's poor and we think about climate change, the answer I hear over and over and over again is, but we can't afford it. I got an email from my local representative from the House of Representatives here in Southwest Virginia telling me how much money he just saved me by voting against the Climate Stewardship Act. Right? I'm going to write him back and thank him a whole lot for saving me a few $100s next year. Okay? Right? If that's what we're concerned about, is a few $100s in electricity, then I think we have some thinking to do. All right? We can't afford it. So these are 2006 data from the World Bank. The United States economy generated $13 trillion in income in 2006. Followed, not even closely, mind you, by Japan, Germany, China, the UK, and France. The global economy generates approximately $30 trillion worth of income, not wealth, every year. But we can't afford it, okay? Sir Nicholas Stern, who issued the Stern Report last year, which is probably the most comprehensive report on climate economics, clearly not infallible, but I would argue some of the best work to date. The cost of stabilization can be limited to around 1% of global GDP a year. Stabilization, so that's mitigation, not adaptation. 1% of GDP a year. And Nicholas Stern is not alone in that estimate. There are others who concur that approximately 1% of global GDP is what it would take to stabilize greenhouse gas emissions. So sticking with the theme of we can't afford it, I thought these numbers were fairly interesting. The cosmetics industry in the United States of America is an $8 billion industry. The ice cream industry in Europe is an $11 billion industry. Again, these are just numbers. Perfumes in Europe and the United States, $12 billion. Pet foods in Europe and the United States, $17 billion. Business entertainment in Japan is a $35 billion annual industry. Cigarettes in Europe, $50 billion spent on cigarettes, 1 year. Alcoholic beverages in Europe, 105. Narcotics trade, estimate, $400 billion a year. Military spending, that's a big number. That would be $1.2 trillion a year, approximately 10% of the United States GDP. To provide basic education for every single human being on the planet would cost about $6 billion. To provide water and sanitation for every human being on the planet would cost about $9 billion. Reproductive health for women, access to reproductive health care, $12 billion. Basic health and nutrition for every child on the planet, approximately $13 billion. Carbon emissions stabilization, 1%, $300 billion. That's a lot bigger than the other ones, obviously, right? And it's something to think about in terms of the opportunity cost wherever you're going to spend, but it still pales in comparison to some of the things that we currently spend on. Just graphically, world military expenditures, peaking in the late 1980s, falling throughout the 1990s, the longest peacetime expansion in the history of the world, and then rising again in the year 2000-ish to once again peaking out at about $1.2 trillion right now. Who's spending this, right? I think that would be the next question to ask. In 2007, the United States made up slightly more than, this number shows slightly less, this figure, slightly more than half of that expenditure happened in the United States of America in 1 year. Okay? The Pentagon's budget in 2008 excuse me, was $743 billion, more than twice the cost of stabilizing carbon emissions. This is the we can't afford it part, remember? Right? We don't have the money. It doesn't exist. Okay? It does exist. It's what we choose to spend it on. What do we value? All the time we hear about taxes. I don't want to pay taxes. I don't want the government to spend my money. What is the government spending our money on? 44.4% of 2009 taxes go to current military spending and the cost of dealing with previous war efforts. 44% of the budget of the 2009 tax collection go to nothing other than direct and indirect military expenditures. But we don't have the money. Remember, it's too expensive. So, all right, I've told you a depressing story about poverty and climate change and how maybe we have our values a little messed up when we say we can't afford it. Maybe we can, and we choose not to deal with those problems. So rather than leaving on that note, what can you do? Okay? Again, I think part of being an educator is to leave your students with that last ray of hope, because I am always hopeful. Okay? This is what I do for a living. I look at these numbers, I think about these numbers, I ask myself why. I want to understand more clearly why we make the decisions that we do. As a behavioral scientist, that's what I'm interested in. Right? But in the end, I'm always optimistic about human beings. The first thing you can do is to support the Millennium Development Goals. And the link here is to the UN website. End Poverty by 2015. There's a heck of a lot of information on this website. There's a bunch of different ways that you can take action if that's something that interests you. Whoops, what'd I do? There we go. Be a banker. Right? Maybe this one sounds a little odd. Right? Be a banker. Eddie knows what I'm talking about. Right? Anyone can be a banker. If you're interested in banking, if you have an entrepreneurial spirit. Microplace. Invest wisely, end poverty. The whole idea of micro enterprise and micro lending has taken off recently, and I hope, as a development economist, will continue to move in the direction of allowing every single person on the planet who has savings to loan that savings to someone else who has an idea but doesn't have financial capital. That's how business works. People have ideas, they go to the bank, they borrow money, and they grow their business. That's all any of the individuals in the developing world, farmers, retail sales associates, teachers, whatever they are doing, that's all anybody wants is an opportunity to improve their well-being. And micro-lending, I think, is one of the ways in which each of you, any of us, can be empowered to not just look at those numbers and think about the daunting task of ending global poverty, of ending hunger, of allowing kids to go to school, but to actually be able to do something about it. And this is not charity. You can set up a business where you are a banker and you can make a living while helping other people. The last piece Get off your ass / get out of your SUV, okay? Right? There's a lot to be done on the climate front, folks, right? Conservation is a huge deal. There's a phenomenal amount of energy that can be saved through simple conservation steps, right? Focus the Nation is a really interesting group working with young people at universities and high schools all over the country, organizing to give a voice to young people who want to see policymakers deal with climate issues. I think one of the things that can happen in the issue of thinking about global climate change is, what could I possibly do? I can turn off my lights, I can turn up the air conditioning a little bit, right? Little pieces. All those little pieces do help. I'm not going to say that they don't, but we need some policy. We need some international negotiations. And the only way in which policymakers and politicians are going to respond is through pressure from people who want to be heard and think that these issues are important. So if you do think that issue is important, Focus the Nation is an amazing place to start. I know a handful of the people who are working in this group, and they do some really fantastic work in terms of not only awareness, but in terms of lobbying efforts, and basically just allowing voices that are often separate and not heard to be collective and heard at a fairly large level. I will leave you with this, a quote from Martin Luther King Jr. "Human progress is neither automatic nor inevitable. We're faced now with the fact that tomorrow is today. We are confronted with the fierce urgency of now. In this unfolding conundrum of life and history, there is such a thing as being too late. We may cry out desperately for time to pause in her passage, but time is deaf to every plea and rushes on. Over the bleached bones and jumbled residues of numerous civilizations are written the pathetic words, too late." Holds today just like it held when he spoke those words. So I appreciate all of your time. There are many things that you could choose to do, and as an economist, I recognize that you've given something up to be here, and I appreciate your willingness to do that, to spend some time with me. So thank you. Thank you very much.